In the wake of the evil visited upon the community of Waukesha, where my wife actually works as an emergency room physician and saw the actual victims of the incident that night, I've received an avalanche of questions that go something like this. If I'm a lawful concealed carry permit holder, and if I was there, could I have used my handgun against the driver of the vehicle to save lives? What are my legal risks and what could go wrong? There's so much legally going on in this situation that it needs to be discussed. But I'm not going to handle it specifically in the context of Waukesha, but rather in the broader context of any time there's a vehicle against a lawful and peaceful crowd and how the use of force laws apply. Let's check it out. In this discussion, we're going to be using Wisconsin law, not only because I'm a Wisconsin attorney, and candidly, that's what I know best, but also because Wisconsin law is fairly middle of the road from what we see across the United States when it comes to use of force scenarios. Let's also save ourselves some time. Imagine every statement that I make is both preceded and followed by something that sounds like this. It is your responsibility to check your local listings by familiarizing yourself with your state's laws. I did not write these laws, not a single one. I'm not advocating for or against the current status of the law and whether or not it should or should not be changed. I'm also not advocating for someone to shoot or not to shoot in this scenario. My only purpose is to help ordinary folks understand the complex legal reality of this sort of situation. Now, you can use deadly force to protect someone other than yourself. We call this defensive other or defensive third person. When and how does this work? Well, broadly speaking, you're going to have to be able to show why that person, in other words, the person that you're seeking to protect, was in reasonable fear of imminent death or great bodily harm. Normally, this can create a problem to ensure that before you use force to protect another, that you know the legal positions of each party. In English, how do you know who is the good guy and who is the bad guy? And not only that, but how do you know that the bad guy did not retreat and was chased by the good guy? This could create a legal reversal of their roles and make it so that self-defense is not available to the original victim. Yeah, it's messy stuff, and that's the risk you take when you use force to protect others. So let's just quickly talk through a couple of the issues here. Number one, was there a deadly threat? Remember, before you can use deadly force, you're going to have to be able to show why there was a deadly threat that you had to engage with in order to stop that threat. If the car is approaching the crowd but hasn't hit anyone yet, there's going to be a fine line between shooting too late and shooting too soon. That's going to be pretty tough to sort out, and that's going to be something that, of course, a prosecutor is going to be picking apart 1/100th of a second at a time. Number two, was the driver and the vehicle still a deadly threat when you pulled the trigger? Okay, so the car approached the crowd and may have hit someone or some people. Were they stopping? Were they turning off the road at the time? Rest assured that, of course, if the driver does make it, they will be making a statement saying that they were in the process of trying to stop. Yeah, right. Maybe that's going to be true some of the time, but that's certainly not going to be true all of the time. Keep in mind, again, these are going to be split-second decisions that you are going to have picked apart for months against you as experts literally go frame by frame of available cell phone and camera footage to figure out when was the appropriate moment to shoot, if any, and when was the appropriate moment to stop shooting. In other words, when the threat had passed. Number three, what happens to the moving vehicle after the driver becomes incapacitated? So you've shot them, they go unconscious. What happens next? It's probably going to be a rare scenario where somehow they just put all of their weight on the brake pedal and the car comes to a safe and immediate stop. More likely, especially if their foot started on the gas, it will continue on the gas. And who knows what direction they may slump and pull the steering wheel in. It could be that basically they had already done the most amount of damage they were going to do until you used deadly force and incapacitated them, which resulted in them on pulling the steering wheel and turning into yet a new crowd. Yeah, who's going to be legally responsible for this? Rest assured, a prosecutor and a bunch of attorneys are going to have some figures to point. You shoot and hit the driver, as well as a bystander. If you cannot legally justify the use of deadly force, then prepare for a long stay in prison. Assuming that you can justify the use of force, under scenario number one, What happens with your bullets hitting the bystander? Wisconsin Statute 939.48 sub 3, and again, many states have something like this, provides protection against criminal charges if you were lawfully acting in self-defense, provided that your actions were reasonable and were not reckless or negligent. It is worth pausing to mention that, due to the wording in the statute, there is an argument that an aggressive prosecutor could make that this protection does not apply to defense of other cases. Meaning, a prosecutor could try to argue that if you hit an unintended innocent bystander while acting reasonably, you would be protected from prosecution if you were acting in self-defense, but not in defense of another. Now, I don't want to get lost in the weeds of interpreting subtle wording arguments in the law. Let's just agree to remember that this issue is out there, but we will set it aside and move forward. In our example, the prosecutor will concede that you benefit from this protection in defense of other or defense of third person. So the question now centers around how reasonable, reckless, or negligent your shooting was when you hit the bystander. Now, I'm someone who prefers examples to help me absorb information, so let's make one up and run with it. Let's imagine that you're part of a large, peaceful, and lawful crowd in a street or in a park. A vehicle comes towards the crowd at a high rate of speed and begins hitting people. You grab your Glock 19 and rapid fire 15 rounds of 9mm at the vehicle from 200 yards away while it is surrounded by a crowd of victims. Is this reasonable? 200 yards is an awfully long distance for judicious marksmanship under the best of circumstances, let alone rapid firing under stress. While the defense of other claim here may be strong, the use of the force was likely unreasonable under the circumstances. Additionally, we also have issues of target isolation, meaning a foreseeable problem of hitting innocent bystanders. My strong suspicion is that in this scenario, you are likely to be facing some major criminal charges if you struck bystanders because of the shooting was not reasonable, and instead was arguably quite reckless. Now the same scenario, except you are in a crowd, but a bit off to the side of the vehicle's course of travel. So you draw your firearm and fire at the driver. Miraculously, you stop the driver and the car. Tragically, you still hit a bystander. Are you in trouble? Once more, how reasonable, reckless, or negligent was your shooting? This is where witnesses and forensic evidence will be relied upon by investigators to answer these questions. Here are a few ways that this could play out. The forensic team determines, somehow, where the bystanders were in relation to your line of fire on the car, and careful examination concludes that the bystander was struck by a pass-through bullet. In fact, amazingly, all three of your bullets struck the bad guy. This means that the bullet hit the intended target of the driver but passed through them to ultimately strike the innocent behind them. This is an example of a more defensible case if a prosecutor decided to file charges since you did hit your target, but this is far from being the only variable. So what other issues could be out there to talk about? A prosecutor could claim that firing 3 shots instead of 1 was unreasonable and reckless. After all, why didn't you shoot, reassess, shoot, reassess? In other words, the prosecutor may try to make a case for why you should go to prison for the next 10 years or longer on homicide charges based on a split-second decision. Where have we heard that before? Now keep in mind, other arguments do exist, including, but certainly not limited to, discussions surrounding the vehicle as a moving target, the presence of windows, etc. However, this shooting will still fall on the more reasonable side of the spectrum. What if one of your bullets missed? The prosecutor can still try to use the same arguments about shoot, reassess, but now there is an implicit argument for anyone who does not know anything about firearms that, of course, your actions were unreasonable and reckless because you missed. While the best shooters in the world may be thrilled beyond belief to land 2 out of 3 shots on a target in this situation, a prosecutor may not be nearly as impressed if they choose to try to hold you to an impossibly high standard of perfect shooting. What are the witnesses going to say? If they claim that you were shooting out of control combined with forensic evidence to show that you badly missed your target by 45 degrees to the side after firing all 15 rounds from your pistol, then we're looking at a far less reasonable and a far more reckless situation. You need to be proficient with your carry firearm, but being able to safely draw and fire is bluntly not enough. Law enforcement officers are also educated and trained and drilled on principles of target acquisition and target isolation, something that not every concealed carry class spends enough time on. Acquisition means that you have identified the correct target, and target isolation means that you have eliminated or at least minimized the risk as much as possible of hitting an innocent bystander. These are crucial concepts to train on, and that this situation obviously calls for and highlights. So what are some key takeaways? I think the main point to remember is to get the feel for this area of law. As the old expression goes, the ends do not justify the means. In other words, if you stop the bad guy but hit bystanders while using force that is unreasonable, reckless, or negligent, then you should brace for criminal charges. And of course, if you didn't think about it, this makes perfect sense. We already have one major problem, namely the guy in the car. We don't need more problems to deal with, including people with good intentions, but they're acting unreasonably or recklessly. This means that, being realistic, these situations are a waking nightmare for both acting as well as not acting, which could save lives or take them. No one is saying that that's fair, but hopefully you learned something by watching this video. Lastly, it's worth also throwing out there that voluntary consumption of intoxicants such as alcohol will not be a defense to the improper use of force. For your browsing convenience, I've included in the description box below some of the law itself that I've been referencing, but the actual technical wording, and that way you can just skim down there. The odds are that the use of force scenario that you might encounter would not look much like this or any of the examples that we discussed. The facts will be different and possibly much less black and white, and instead much more gray. Depending upon where you live, the law may also likely change, but it may also be pretty similar. I hope that this discussion and review of the law, with a few examples thrown in, got you to thinking about some of the legal issues that are out there in situations like these. Now I want to hear from you. What would you do in this situation? Leave a comment below and be sure to explain why you would do or not do whatever it is that you're choosing to do. If you enjoyed this video, please give us a like, consider subscribing to this channel for more content. A like helps us a lot with the YouTube search algorithms and also tells me how much you value whatever particular video we're talking about. I appreciate you staying with me to the end, and until next time, stay safe.